Saints of the Americas is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church celebrated in the Americas. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Welcome to our show. We're going to begin by talking about St. Francis Xavier Cabrini, a beautiful person from Italy that has a very rich life and really enriched the church here in the United States. So let's tell the folks that are with us a little bit about her life from the beginning.
Well, I think, as you mentioned, originally from Italy, one of the things that we know, or is most commonly known about her, is she is considered the first saint of the United States, though she is a naturalized citizen. So we know that she was born in Italy, grew up in Italy. Her baptismal name was Francesca. And we know that from an early age, she wanted to be a missionary. And so you have to put yourself in a mindset of a young girl that, what does that sense of missionary even mean? You know, from her place in Italy, undoubtedly she would have heard stories of other places, come to know maybe a little bit more about some cultures, but she felt herself called to move beyond her locale. She was a woman of great faith. She ends up joining and promoting a religious community. And one of the things that we know about her is that she did suffer from poor health. We know that when she had this desire to go and be a sister in another country and to be a missionary, her bishop was a little concerned, some apprehension about her frail health. But the bishop still gave her the charge to start this new religious community. We know that once this community was formed, it reached the level of Pope Leo XIII, and he had a strong desire that her sisters would go and serve the immigrant population in the United States. And so that's how she arrives here.
Let's kind of go back a little bit to shortly after she died, and then we'll pick up with her missionary work in the United States. But her canonization process really started only a short decade, almost 11 years after her death, which was kind of unusual probably at the time, because we know that the canonization process is really sometimes a long and timely one, and saints oftentimes are not declared blessed or canonized long after, maybe even centuries after their death. What made her perhaps special with her cult of looking into the process of her sainthood?
Well, and as you mentioned, that was relatively rare at the time. Now, I think for many of our viewers, they might be more influenced by the rather quick process of St. John Paul II or St. Mother Teresa. Those two examples are rare. We've talked in this series about people who are still on the road to sainthood, who perhaps lived long before Francis Xavier Cabrini. What we recognize in someone like Francis Xavier Cabrini, as was recognized in Teresa of Calcutta and John Paul and others like them, was this greater sense of their service, and as you said, a cult that develops around it. The people of their time really are the ones who bring this to attention. It is the people who proclaim her life and her legacy worthy of sainthood, much like the calls even at John Paul's funeral, you know, sainthood now. So we see that her, and as we then go back a little bit and talk about her ministry, it was the way in which she was reaching out to people, ministering to all of those people at that time. And there really was this recognition that there was a saint walking among them. And so it merely was her death that was the only stumbling block they saw to her being proclaimed a saint. And so, as you said, it opens up just 11 years after, and she's actually canonized within 30 years of her death. At that time, very rare.
It's interesting, when we were talking about her missionary work and her missionary zeal, she initially wanted to go to the Orient, to China, to really exercise her faith and share the gospel with those who had never heard of Jesus. But obviously, as you had said, the Pope wanted her to come to America because there was a great influx of Italian immigrants at the time. And we see this whole idea of the United States being really kind of an immigrant country over our years, beginning with our founding, with the English and then the Irish, and then subsequently Europeans coming into the country. So this whole sense that they knew, the church knew, that they had to send missionaries to other lands in order to make sure that the gospel continued to flourish and to grow. And so that brings us back to the idea that the United States, at some point in its beginnings, was really missionary territory. And so how this woman from Italy comes here because she has this burning desire to share faith. And let's talk about how important the immigrant church is, especially here nowadays in the 21st century.
Well, again, we are an immigrant church in the United States, as you mentioned, and I think one of the reasons why Leo XIII would have wanted people like Francis Xavier Cabrini to come here back in the late 1800s would be a very similar concern, I don't want to say fear, but concern that would be in the 21st century, and it's that loss of Catholic identity. You know, the sense that if you have these large populations of Catholics from Italy or from France or from Poland or Germany, wherever they may have been coming here into a more Protestant mindset, a country, or maybe even one that moves away from any sense of religious practice, that's going to diminish the faith. And eventually you're going to have people just not practicing their faith, and that's not going to be important to them. So people like Francis Xavier Cabrini were there to continue to pass on that gift of faith. That was essential to the church flourishing in the early, into the mid, and even late 1900s. I would say there's a similar concern of how we continue to evangelize. So we've gone from missionary effort more, it's made that move to evangelization. But a similar need, people who already have faith needing to grow in that faith and not have it fall by the wayside.
We know that, as you had mentioned previously, that Mother Cabrini had some frail health issues, and so even her desire to come to the United States or to do missionary work was really questioned, but she continued to do that, and I think she is even quoted as saying that, "Oh Jesus, I love you very much, tell me what you wish me to do, and do with me as you will." And so obviously she was open to what the will of God was. The opening prayer of the Mass says this: "God our Father, you called Francis Xavier Cabrini from Italy to serve the immigrants of America. By her example, teach us concern for the stranger, the sick, and the frustrated. By her prayers, help us to see Christ in all the men and women we meet." That's certainly a call for us as we are people who welcome others into the faith, whether they're immigrants or whether they're people who were born here. That is our call, and that is the will of God. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. The Society of St. Paul announces a new book called Saints of the USA by Brother Marco Buccarelli. This book, for children ages 6 and up, will fascinate young readers as they learn more about the saints of North America. Those who read it will meet 10 figures who have lived lives of holiness, as well as the Immaculate Conception of Mary, patroness of the United States. The book can be found at St. Paul's Books and Gifts at 926 Boardman Poland Road on Route 224. The store is open Monday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. or call 330-953-2443 or email at stpaulsbookstore@gmail.com and learn more about these saints of our time.
I am Maryknoll.
Yo soy Maryknoll.
Maryknoll, an American Catholic organization of priests and brothers, has been reaching out to those in need for nearly 100 years in 26 countries throughout the world. Missioners, workers, volunteers, supporters, we are all Maryknoll.
I'm Father Mike, and I am Maryknoll.
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 Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about Saint Damien Joseph de Veuster. We know him familiarly as Damien of Molokai. Very holy man, very rich history and background, especially in our 50th state. So let's talk about the beginnings of Father Damien.
Well, you mentioned his middle name, Joseph. That was his birth name. Joseph is born in 1840 in Belgium to a rather large family. We know that whatever the circumstances were, at the age of 13, he was forced to quit school and to help out on the family farm, to help the family survive. We do know that 6 years later, though, he's able to enter the congregation of the Sacred Heart of Jesus and Mary. And at that point, then, he decides to take the name of the 4th century physician and martyr Damien. And so that's where his name comes from. And so it's very interesting that he takes the name of a early church physician and one who offers their life as a martyr in the service of Christian people. And we'll see that sense of healing and that sense of offering one's life really lived out in the rest of his ministry. We know then that he, at one point, is seeking to be of more service. We know that his brother was a priest and that his brother becomes ill. And so as a result of all of this, Damien finds his way to the Hawaiian Islands. And it's in Honolulu that he is actually ordained a priest. So he's not a priest in Belgium. He then moves as a missionary and one to serve people in this other land. And that's where his final call of ordination comes.
I think we talked about that in previous shows where someone who was studying for the priesthood would not necessarily have been ordained in their own country of their birth, but then when they came to the United States as a missionary, they were ordained here within the diocese that they were called to serve in. And so, you know, we really see that influx of young seminarians, of those who were to be ordained priests coming to the United States and meeting a particular need. And obviously this need was very great because he went to Hawaii. He went in very devastating times where this disease of leprosy was rampant and really fairly unknown to the medical world. And so let's talk a little bit about the stigma of having a disease and also working among those who have this illness.
Well, as we look at the disease of leprosy, what Damien encountered in his life in the 1800s is no different from what we hear of those who suffered from leprosy during the time of Jesus. We know that in the scriptures, those who were lepers, whether they were wealthy or whether they were impoverished, were ostracized from the community. We hear about those who were lepers, they're moving on the outskirts of the towns and only hear these stories of Jesus. That's how they have the courage to come and be healed. They're not part of the throngs that are there to welcome Jesus into any community. They are already cast out. And it's no different many centuries later. These people are cast from their own homes, cast from their communities because of the ravages of this illness and the fear of contamination, the fear that it's going to run rampant in a community. And so that really is, the devastation of that disease is not only is it taking a physical toll, it takes a spiritual and an emotional toll. You are just removed from all contact of other people. You have only other lepers to come into contact with. And really it becomes a death sentence that slowly but surely, one by one, you're going to leave this world. And so that's the stigma for the leper. The stigma of those who sought to minister to them and offer compassion was no different. They themselves then were ostracized from the community. No one wanted them to kind of go minister to the lepers and then come back into the community for fear, again, of that contamination. So to have the courage and the spiritual fortitude to feel this as a calling was something so great in Damien and in many other people's lives as well.
And I think we see this isolation happen even geographically. There was an island, the island of Molokai, where they were literally banished and left on their own to survive and to live. And so when people like Father Damien comes into their world and their kind of miserable life, and Lot, he tries to bring them hope. He tries to bring them grace. He tries to bring them the Lord. And this is exactly why he is raised to the level of the saints. And so we also know that at one point in his life, Father Damien contracts leprosy. Let's briefly talk about that.
Well, after several years of ministering to the people, he himself does contract leprosy. He announces in 1885 that he has contracted leprosy, but he continues in his ministry. He musters all the strength he can. He, even as a leper, he's still building hospitals and clinics and churches. Some 600 coffins. That might sound a little odd to the people, but that was something that was needed. They had to completely take care of themselves. Even, nowadays you call a funeral home. No one wanted to deal with them, even in death. And so one of the ministries was to build coffins so that there could be the dignity of Christian burial for these people. So he continues in all of that ministry, and then he himself dies in April of 1888, living with the disease himself for 3 years. And as requested, he is buried there. The Belgian government gets involved, and there's all kinds of things that go on, but he himself was desired to be with the people he ministered with.
And we also know very briefly that his statue is in the U.S. Capitol. Let's talk about that.
I think we've mentioned in another episode the unique honor that is given. There are, each of the 50 states is invited to have 2 statues in Statuary Hall, and he is one of 2 that represents Hawaii. And so we know that what great affection the Hawaiian people have for this man who came to minister and to serve, and ultimately, as his namesake, to heal, but to offer his own life.
And we close with the opening prayer of his Mass. It states, God our Father, in St. Damien of Molokai, you gave a light to your faithful people. You made him a pastor of the church to feed your sheep with his word and to teach them. By his example, help us by his prayers to keep the faith he taught and follow the way of life he showed. And this is so important for us to understand as people who reach out to those, especially the outcast, that we do so with the hand of God, with the love of God. And this is why Damien was elevated to the life of the saints, and we celebrate him. And we'll talk about another saint who was intimately involved in the island of Molokai as well. But we need to take a break. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. The Society of St. Paul announces a new book on Louis and Zélie Martin, parents of St. Therese of the Child Jesus. The book focuses on her parents' journey towards sanctity in their family life and social commitments. This book was compiled for couple and group sharing and is meant to strengthen the journey of all in marriage and family life towards sanctity and holiness. The book can be found at St. Paul's Books and Gifts at 926 Boardman Poland Road on Route 224, located across from the Olive Garden restaurant. The store is open Monday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. or call 330-953-2443 or email at stpaulsbookstore@gmail.com and learn more about these witnesses of our time.
33 million Americans have descended into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.
We are in our 7th year at Cristo Rey Jesuit High School. It arose from the desire of the Jesuits in the Chicago province to serve the Hispanic community here in Chicago. One of the things that's unique about this school is that our kids work 5 days a month at offices in downtown Chicago to pay for their education. That idea originated here. We got telephone calls the first day from the companies thanking us for sending us those kids to their companies. The companies feel good about themselves. 95% of our kids are the first ones in their families to finish high school, and 87% of our graduates are in college right now. This project attracts wonderful, wonderful, enthusiastic, idealistic people. They have to have the desire to kind of reach for the stars. No one believed that it would be as successful as it is. Well, it's obviously caught on, and we're very, very excited about it.
Welcome back to our show. We're going to talk now about Saint Marianne Cope. And as we spoke about Father Damien in the previous segment, we're going to talk about another missionary to the island of Molokai. She also has a very rich background as a religious woman. And let's talk about her early life in Germany.
Well, it was a very early life in Germany. Though she is born in Heidelberg in Germany, her family comes to the United States when she is only 1 year old. Mm-hmm. And so they settle in New York. And when she's 15, she starts to feel the call to religious life. But at that point, there was need for money for the family, and she was earning wages in a factory. And so we see this was a time when young children would also go to work. We see that it's no longer just on the farm and helping around the house, but we see with the Industrial Revolution that even young children are able to go to work in factories to help earn a living. And so that was something that she needed greatly. However, a month after her father died in 1862, when she was 24, she has the courage to enter religious life. This is her calling. This is what she's wanted to do for a long time. And so she enters the Third Order of St. Francis, a religious community founded by John Neumann, a saint of the United States. And it is there that she taught in elementary schools in New York and eventually becomes a member of the governing board of her community. And she's involved in the decision to open hospitals in Utica and in Syracuse. So, as you said, she has a rich life as a religious sister. She has to put that dream on hold for a while. She then becomes a religious sister, but she's more involved in the mindset of what we think many religious sisters in the United States did, schools and hospitals. But we see that there's going to be a little turn because of the gentleman that we just spoke about in our last segment, Father Damien. He needs people to come and join him in his ministry. And so he writes to many religious sisters, of which one is Marianne Cope.
You know, it's interesting because she brings to Molokai this great, not only missionary desire and also to reach out to the sick and the suffering, but this wealth of knowledge in hospital work and health care. And so she brings something that's certainly desperately needed on the island of Molokai. We know that she arrived in 1883. 2 years later, Father Damien himself contracts Hansen's disease and becomes a leper himself. So we see her, really working side by side with Father Damien. And, we need to say that she arrives in Hawaii at the age of 45. So in really beyond the middle of her life, she really comes to expel her time and energy, and she basically spends an entire 35 years in the Hawaiian Islands, specifically on the island of Molokai, helping the people, continuing the work that Father Damien really began. Let's talk about once she came to Hawaii, what were some of the things that she found, and what were some of the things that she worked with in order to build up that desperate community?
Well, once she arrived there, it was very blatant that she was needed, the sisters were needed, but there were a lot of things, as you said, that needed to be done. A lot of work needed to be done. She needed to establish, obviously, a community so that more sisters could join them. There was a need to obtain a lot of governmental approval. There were a lot of plans that were needed. As you said, she was able to help them with a lot of the implementation of a healthcare system, of what hospitals were. It's one thing to just say we're going to build a hospital, but if you don't have all of that background, remember again, Damien, as much as he wanted to minister and serve the people, was more a missionary and didn't bring that specific background. And so that's why he and the others that were with him were reaching out to these types of sisters to come. We know that they begin their work with a branch hospital where there were 200 patients that crowded the hospital immediately. We know that from this then there was a need to raise funds, to build more rooms, and sometimes even the hospitals, they were being built room by room. Right. As soon as they could build a room, it was filled with patients, and then another room would be built. It was kind of like the building project that never ended. But this was so much something that was needed. They also recognized the need to minister to those who were abandoned by the scourges of this illness. There were a lot of homeless women because the husband might have contracted the disease and died. No one wanted to interact with the spouse of someone. So we see the ministry to homeless women and shelters for that. So a lot of other ministries grow up as a result of Marianne Cope's presence on Molokai.
Well, and I think that's really kind of fundamental to reaching out and responding to needs. When you first encounter a need, you respond to it. But then you try to help that person move beyond that to help others, and also to ensure that they don't encounter those same straits or needs again. So there's always almost like a learning and a teaching process that happens. And we know that when Mother Cope came to Hawaii, she also brought some other sisters with her. And then this ministry really kind of burgeoned out, not just in Molokai, but to some of the other islands where facilities were very much needed, as you had mentioned, facilities for homeless women and children, hospitals and healthcare centers. And so there was this whole move to reach out to the entire community and to the entire area of Hawaii and the islands. Let's talk a little bit about, in our close, about the ministry that Father Damien and Mother Marianne Cope shared together, and how important it was to work in collaboration with one another.
Well, as we mentioned, together they only have a few years of really working together. He does die a few years after she arrives, or contracts an illness a few years after she arrives, and then he dies 3 years later. But they really, we've talked a lot about the health care, and we've talked about the physical. But what I think they really also provided each other were they provided a spiritual understanding for people, but they also, as you said, they dealt with the immediacy, but then they also had to deal with how to stop this. And so we see that among their other efforts are how to advocate for better sanitary conditions. How do you negate the illness from continuing to happen? It's one thing to say, well, we're just going to continue to minister to them as they die and build room after room after room, but how to negate the illness and how to help that to stop. One of the things that became abundantly clear to Mother Marianne was that her work with the lepers, she was not going to be going back to Syracuse. It was not going to be possible for her to go back to the mainland United States. And so it really did become her new home. And as you said, meeting all the needs, but reaching out in other ways. And so she sees after Damien dies that she continues, the sisters continue to grow and flourish. She lives to the age of 80, and doesn't die until 1918. And so his death was 30 years prior to that. And so she continues to minister and continues to reach out and to make a difference in his name and in her name.
And thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Saints of the Americas was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.